Hello, friends. I'm Lady Sophoclea, and welcome to the Hermekateia podcast. In today's episode, I'm going to be talking about Hermekateia, what it is, and what a divine union between Hermes and Hekate is. I'm also going to talk about unverified personal gnosis, and a little bit more in depth this time. And in order to do this, I'm just going to give a brief overview of thought, vibration, and frequency as it's seen in Hermekateia and in relation to unverified personal gnosis. So before we get into it, I just want to say it has been a time recording this podcast. I have had everything happen. I have actually recorded it and then scrapped the recording and started over again because I blame Mercury in retrograde because I just had a hard time gathering my thoughts, exactly what I want to say and how to explain the things that I want to talk about. So I did just want to mention that because this podcast is coming out a whole lot later than I intended. And unfortunately, that is the reason why, is because I really struggled with the logistics of it, but also kind of going off on tangents about this thing or that thing. So I'm going to do my best to keep my thoughts organized. So this is an off-the-cuff podcast. I don't write down everything and then read off of a document or anything like that. So rather, I just kind of speak off the top of my head. But on this particular podcast, it's not really the best way to manage it because I'm literally talking about the core tenets of the religion and how Hermekateia are viewed within the belief system. And so it's a lot. It's going to be a little bit heavy. This is going to be a little bit of a longer episode. And so part of it, the main basic concepts are going to be available for everyone. And then I'm going to go a bit more in depth with my patrons. So let's dive in. So when it comes to thought, we humans like to think that our thoughts belong to us. And on a scientific level, we think that they originate within our brain. Hermekateia teaches that thought does not actually belong to us, that the brain is actually serving more of a radio antenna. You can think of it like a radio. Like you tune in to a particular frequency, and then you pick up that radio station and you listen to whatever is on that radio station. Well, vibration and frequency work a lot like that. When we make a real solid effort to elevate our thinking and our minding, we will pick up that frequency. Whatever frequency we're on, we're going to pick up whatever's on that frequency. So for example, when we're feeling low, we tend to attract a lot of intrusive negative thoughts. And we think that we are the ones that are thinking these thoughts, creating these thoughts, that they're coming from us, when actually what's happening is we're picking up a frequency. And that frequency is a self-perpetuating cycle. We get into the low frequency, we pick up the low thoughts, we accept these thoughts as our own, and we believe in these thoughts, and we allow these thoughts to take over our life. I've been there. I'm sure many other of my listeners have been there as well. And this self-perpetuating cycle can be counteracted, and really the only way to counteract it is to practice self-love and positive affirmations every day, all through the day, until you can raise your vibration out of that hole, out of that self-perpetuating cycle of negativity. So that's just one example of how our brain acts as an antenna, and a lot of it has to do with our mood and our emotion, how we're feeling at the time. That will raise or lower our vibration, enabling us to pick up thoughts that are on that frequency. But the thing about these thoughts, and what's really, really important to remember, something I really want to get across to all Hermekateans and anyone else that this is helpful for, is that you don't have to accept any thought that crosses your mind, ever. You don't have to accept it. You do not have to give your consent to that thought. And knowing that actually is very liberating. Because when we feel like our thoughts are coming from us, that they're coming from our brain, then we feel responsible for our thoughts. Then that can send us into a negative spiral of, why am I having these thoughts? Why am I thinking like this? Oh, these are thoughts that exist in my head, so I must be, this kind of person or whatever. When the fact of the matter is that those thoughts never belonged to you in the first place. And so important, you do not need to give your consent to any thought that crosses your head, ever. And then understanding that helps us to understand how unverified personal gnosis works. So when you work with deity, you can experience all sorts of revelation that is coming to you. And again, when you begin communing with deity, and especially like the deeper you go, the more you learn about that deity and the more you work with that deity, you will come to find that you're experiencing a lot of sort of thoughts that are telling you information that you didn't know, or telling you information that maybe you knew somewhere way back inside yourself, and you know it to be truth. You know it to be like sort of truth beyond truth. And I'm sure, people have experienced this where someone will say something to you, for example, and you'll be like, wow, that was so profound. And it causes you to sort of rethink things and offers you a new perspective that you hadn't thought of before. Well, the same thing can happen with unverified personal gnosis. The only difference with UPG is that it's not someone outside saying these things to you. It's sort of like thoughts that just pop in your head and you're like, wow, really? And, it causes you to think deeper about these things. This is what it's like to work with deity and work closely with deity. And once again, you do not have to accept any thought that crosses your mind. If you're working with deity and you feel like you're receiving something, but you don't necessarily understand exactly what is coming through, or it doesn't really resonate with you, you don't have to accept it just because you were working with deity at that moment. You don't ever have to accept it. But that was just a very brief and simplistic overview of sort of how thought and vibration and frequency work and how UPG works. So now I'd like to talk about, now that we've talked about thought a little bit and how it sort of comes through our heads or through our brains, I would like now to speak about where these thoughts originate. And where they originate is where all things in the universe originate. And that is in the Corpus Hermeticum, it's called God. And of course, in Judeo-Christian religion, it's also called God. I don't really like that. I don't think it's a particularly effective or descriptive term for what we're talking about when we talk about the source of everything in the universe. So I've heard a lot of people, like in the spiritual community, call it source. And so that's what I've kind of gone with, is calling it source, because it is the source of everything. And the Hermetics in ancient times and the Neoplatonists went back and forth a lot about like the source and the quote-unquote demiurge, which is sort of separate from source, but also from source. And whether there was some sort of like separate creative source in the universe that created everything, or whether everything all goes back to one source, The way that I view source is I view source as the source of everything. According to Hermeticism, it is mind. Like the mind consciousness is like the overarching sort of creative force in the universe that everything, literally everything, originates from. We're all a little piece of source. And the way that I personally view source and the way that I've incorporated it into Hermekateia is that source is sort of one overarching entity, but it has a dual nature. And the dual nature is on one side masculine, on the other side feminine. On one side order, the other side chaos, one side structural, the other side ethereal, etc. And I'm going to get into this more a little bit later. But I just wanted to introduce that concept of source being sort of one thing, but having two sides. We'll just leave it at that for now. We'll get into it in depth a little bit later. But for now, I did just want to give this sort of brief overview of the source of everything in the universe and how I view that. And so now I'd like to talk about our little place in the universe. And I'm not just talking about Earth or the solar system. I'm actually talking about our level of consciousness, the things that we experience and the things that we perceive. So the purpose of this level of consciousness, which I would call three-dimensional consciousness, there is, of course, the fourth dimension of time, which we also experience. We are, in fact, fourth-dimensional beings living a third-dimensional experience, and I will get into all of that much later in a different podcast. For now, it's important to know that this existence, this level of consciousness, or this plane of existence, the purpose of it is to play out ideas in a physical realm. The way that scenarios are played out in this world is very unique. This is the only place where you can really play these things out in the way that we do. So, of course, Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage, and that I very much believe. I do believe that this world is a staging ground where we play out different ideas, different concepts, different scenarios, and we carry them to their extreme, to the furthest extent that we can before returning back to a sort of stasis and trying a different route. So probably the best example that I could really give of it would be the Roman Empire. So the Roman Empire, it starts, of course, not as an empire, as this little village, basically. And it, blows up eventually to this huge empire, which encompasses most of the known world, at least the known world in the West. And of course, it went on and on. It went on so long that people thought that it was permanent, that life would always be like this. And then, of course, it wasn't. Rome fell. But before it fell, a lot of ideas they carried, straight to their conclusion. Such as conquest, for example. They conquered as much of the world as they possibly could, and then they lost control because their borders were too large. Eventually, it did collapse, and Europe went back to a sort of stasis, similar to the way it had been prior to the Roman Empire, where you had kind of all these little tribes around, but there wasn't any really cohesive culture as was present in the Roman Empire. So, you had Rome, it got carried to its logical conclusion. They took every idea as far as it could, from being something that worked and something that was good to being something that didn't work at all anymore. So now I'd like to speak about a very, very, very little bit about physics. I'm not a physicist, but I do want to give a really brief overview to sort of explain that everything that we see or experience in this world is an illusion. It's all a bunch of illusions that our brains create for us in order for us to understand the world around us. So, our brain creates illusions, essentially lying to us all the time, constantly. But it has to, because if it didn't do that, then we would never be able to make sense of the world we find ourselves in. And when it comes to magic, spirits, divinity, these things, there's a lot in physics. There are some really, really great areas of physics like chaos theory, string theory, and then, of course, quantum physics, the most popular, everybody knows. But again, I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to get into all that. What I did want to discuss is something that I feel is very important. We're talking about sort of our brains and the way that we comprehend the world around us. One of the most interesting things to me is that, and again, I'm far from being an expert in this field, so please don't quote me, but the way that I understand it, the molecular structure of things in this reality is that things don't actually touch. So we experience things with our senses, but that's really just our senses picking that up. There's nothing actually touching. When you think about, the floor, say you are on the rooftop of a building. You're on the roof. You're way up high. There is nothing actually holding you there. Well, there is. It's the physics of how things work together. But in terms of you touching the floor and the floor being this solid thing that is holding you up, that's an illusion. And so I wanted to talk about that to explain how everything in this world is illusory. Everything that we experience ever is an illusion. It's all illusory. And it's all based in our faith in that illusion. And I wanted to run that little thought experiment with you to sort of explain how faith and belief actually work. So the last thing that I wanted to touch on when we're talking about the physical world around us and the nature of it and what it is, I wanted to talk about the life, death, rebirth cycle, because this is, obviously not something that only humans are subjected to, but it's not even only something that what we consider to be living things, plants, animals. It isn't just living things or what we consider to be living things that are subject to this cycle, but it goes all the way up to planets, stars, galaxies, all of it. That is the nature of this reality. Everything is born, everything lives according to its timeline, and then everything dies, and then everything is reborn. You can literally see this in nature all around us. For example, autumn comes, all the leaves die, fall off. Winter comes, everything is dead around, nothing is growing. Not much is growing. There are obviously some things that can grow in winter, but not much is growing. And then spring comes along and everything springs back to life. And of course, the year is the temporal embodiment of this cycle. So as long as we are in this sort of 3D consciousness, sort of 3D reality, we are all subject to this life, death, rebirth cycle. And it isn't only over the course of life. For example, you're born, you live your life, and then you die. But this will happen many, 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 many times over the course of your life. You will renew yourself in a way. You'll redefine yourself in a way. And then you'll be that for a while, and then you'll drop that off to the side and go to the next thing. So, for example, you can think maybe about like the identity that you had in high school, the group that you was your crowd, and then maybe, of course you graduate, and at a certain age you outgrow all of that. Now you're in college, or now you're starting your career, and that's a new area of life that has opened up to you. That's a new sort of rebirth of who you are. You might get married. You might have children. You will be reborn as a spouse and a parent. That's a new life, a whole new life that has started for yourself. The life that you had before is over. That is what the life, death, rebirth cycle is all about. And when we think about this as something that happens so many times to us over the course of life, it doesn't seem so daunting to think about the end. So this cycle is the nature of the reality that we live in. And so I think it is vitally important to think about and talk about this cycle as it ebbs and flows throughout our lives. So now I want to give a brief history and a brief overview of the Thoth-Hermes connection. So Thoth is the Egyptian god and Hermes is the Greek god. So first, I did just want to briefly mention that source, when we talk about source, when we talk about God, this concept comes from ancient Egypt. And the ancient Egyptians, like especially when you go all the way back to the Bronze Age, it was kind of the spiritual center of the Bronze Age. And of course, every society, every civilization had its own religion, its own belief system. But in ancient Egypt, you had this concept of devotion. You had this concept of an overarching deity. Egyptian religion was extremely well developed. Its followers were devout and its priests were powerful. And at times, the priests were actually the most powerful people in Egypt, more powerful than the pharaoh even. So the Egyptians had this god that the Greeks called Thoth. I'm actually not sure what his name was in ancient Egyptian or if I could even come close to pronouncing it, but that's what the Greeks called him. And when Herodotus, one of the very first, really, I think probably the very first historian ever, but when he arrives with his, people that he was traveling with, the Greeks that he was traveling with in Egypt, he discovered that the Greek religion, the Greek cosmology actually originated in ancient Egypt. And of course, he wrote about this. And so by the time Alexander the Great comes along, this is deeply, deeply embedded in Greek belief system and Greek culture that it originated in Egypt. And that was actually specifically why Alexander the Great wanted to go to Egypt and wanted to get the Egyptians to name him a god. So that was extremely important to Alexander the Great because it was like saying, if these people who originated our people's belief system, our religion, if they say I'm a god, then all Greek people will view me as a god. And so he did. And then later on, one of his men, Ptolemy, took control of Egypt, and they made their power center in the city that the Macedonians had built, which is Alexandria. And from there, we really see the birth of Hermeticism coming out of Alexandria. And additionally, the temple for Thoth, the Egyptian temple to Thoth, the town, the village that was next to it, the Greeks named Hermopolis. So going again back to Hermes and that connection. Now, on a side note, I've managed to find it on Google Earth. But when I look at it, it really looks like the ruins of a Greek temple. So it was supposed to be the original site of the Egyptian temple to Thoth. So now I'd like to get into Hermeticism a bit. And Hermeticism pops up in Alexandria shortly before the Roman Empire starts to kind of take over and become big. It was around that time that Hermeticism was starting to really become a thing in Alexandria. And I'd like to talk about the Hermetic texts. Now, I very, very, very strongly recommend, if you want to understand Hermeticism and you want to understand Hermes and you want to understand that connection with Thoth, it is vitally important. It is of paramount importance that you study Hermetic texts. But Hermetic texts are notoriously difficult to read. So if you're interested in studying Hermetic texts, I would like to refer you to a YouTuber that I've been watching for a few years now. He is not himself a Hermeticist, at least not that I can gather, but he breaks down the Hermetic texts, and he is a professor of theology. His name is Justin Sledge. I very highly recommend you check him out. He's in my recommendations, I believe, on my Substack, on my YouTube, maybe on my Instagram. I'm not quite sure, but I know I put him on my YouTube for sure. So he's in my recommendations there. Very, very highly recommend him because he does break down these texts in a way that you can understand them. And he also has a study guide that can help you in studying the Hermetic texts. Another YouTuber that I strongly recommend is The Modern Hermeticist. That's just another YouTuber that offers their perspective on the Hermetic texts. So it's he's another great resource for you to check out. So now I'd like to talk about the core tenets of Hermekateia and my role as Lady Sophoclea as High Priestess of Hermekateia. So first, we'll talk about the core tenets. So the very first and most important tenet of Hermekateia is ascension. Ascension is the goal. The goal is to transmute and transmute and transmute ourselves until we can become the best version of ourselves and give ourselves the best chance of ascension. So what exactly does ascension mean, and how does one achieve it? So for me, I was first introduced to the idea of ascension of the spirit when I was 18. I took a philosophy course over the summer. It was not the greatest course of my life, but that was where I was very first introduced to Buddhism, and which I didn't know anything about before. And Buddhism introduced me to the idea, because I always knew about reincarnation. Let's just put it this way, reincarnation is not a thing that I have the luxury of not believing in. So I've always believed in it. All my life I have believed in reincarnation. Even when I was a little kid and a Christian, I believed in it. So you could argue I wasn't actually Christian because I didn't have the agency to make that kind of decision at that point in my life. But regardless, reincarnation was always, always, always something that was very real and very true for me. What Buddhism introduced me to was the concept of transcending that process, transcending that life, death, rebirth cycle. And when I started studying Hermeticism, I realized that was exactly what the Hermetics were trying to teach. They were trying to teach ascension. They were trying to teach transcendence of this cycle. First they had to establish that there was anything to transcend, and then what transcending meant, what was maybe on the other side of that. And that's something that Buddhism was very concerned with, and that's something that also Hermeticism was very concerned with. We're all in different places on our soul's journey. And we're all in different places in our soul's journey here on earth. But the point, I believe, is to learn as much as you can, while you have access to all this information about ascension. So learning these things, it's never wasted. It's never ever wasted. The second tenet of Hermekateia is that there is no one true path for all humanity. Humanity is not a monolith. We are individuals. My path, may not be the right path for you, and vice versa. And you know what? That's okay. But we're going to hold space here in Hermekateia for all who wish to follow our path, even if it's only for a time, because there's wisdom to be gained for us and for them. So we want to be welcoming to everyone. But if someone decides somewhere along the way, hey, this isn't the path for me, that's okay. Because you will have learned from us and we will have learned from you. And if this path has led you to your path, then that's a great thing. And I'm going to be extremely happy for you. There is no wasted knowledge on this path. There is no wasted time on this path. Hey, glad you found me, and thank you for listening. For the full version of this podcast, you can either join me on Substack or on Patreon. Thank you.